Hi, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. We're so excited for this first in a monthly series of webinars that brings cutting-edge concepts to librarianship. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that our presenter today is Ron Eglesh, who joined our faculty at the University of Michigan last year and has an appointment both in the School of Information and in the Stamp School of Art and Design. He's going to be talking today about a topic that is really fascinating, and we're sitting in his office looking at all of his artifacts right now. And he's going to talk about teaching STEM with Indigenous algorithms and what the implications are of this far-reaching work that he's been doing. He's really been an innovator in this area. So before we start, we do want to thank our sponsors on the next slide. This series is co-produced by the University of Michigan School of Information, the Library of Michigan, with funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and Ron's work is sponsored by the National Science Foundation. And now I'll turn it over to Ron, but before I do know that there is a chat. There is a chat feature. I'll be monitoring it if you have questions for Ron or you have expertise you want to land to share with others. I know I see folks like Tierney and Jen who have done a lot of work with STEM in their libraries. We'd love to see you pull your information together. So with that being said, over to you, Ron.
Thank you, Kristen. So we're going to be talking today about culturally situated design tools. And these are interactive tools that are using heritage algorithms. So the concepts from these Indigenous cultures. But I wanted to make a little preface first about why we bother doing that. So there's a lot of problems created by today's economies. Our extractive economies are dumping pollution into nature, they're extracting labor value, and they're causing extreme forms of wealth inequality. We'd like to switch over to a more circular economy, a generative economy. And so these heritage algorithms are actually a part of that transformation. So let me give you a little bit of detail about what that word generative means. If you look at molecules like DNA, they self-generate. If you look at organisms, they have children, and those children become adults, and the adults have children. If you look at ecosystems, they're self-organizing and self-repairing. So at every scale, the power of life is due to a form of self-generation. Schrodinger, the physicist, termed this negative entropy. And there's beautiful indigenous traditions, such as African traditions, Native American traditions, that are also based on this idea of a recursive loop of circulating value. The problem is when you get to an extractive economy, nature and labor and human expression is still generating that value, but it's being sucked up, vacuumed up by these large corporations and these large institutions, and very little value gets returned to the average person. Now, you might think that that's just a problem of capitalism, but if you look at pollution and labor exploitation under communist state governments, you have the same problems there. So that's why we feel like the solution really lies in a transformative move, changing the way that we're doing science and technology in relation to these institutions. And if you go back to indigenous cultures before the extractive economy, you can see those circular flows of value at work. So this is one of my favorite examples, the Adinkra manufacturing economy in West Africa and Ghana. You start with the body tree, Brydelia ferungia, and you shave off the bark from that tree. So folks are still doing this. These are photos from our fieldwork. And then you boil down that bark for several days, and you get both a medicine, which has excellent pharmacological properties it can be used against dysentery. And eventually, if you boil it down far enough, you get an ink that's used in a stamped cloth tradition called Adinkra. And so you can see one of the Adinkra symbols here. It's two crocodiles that share the same stomach. The idea is that why would you fight over food? Because both mouths are feeding the same belly. So it's a great symbol for this idea of the cultural commons, that we should be sharing resources, and then everybody who needs something can take something out of it. Once that bark has all of its tannins extracted from it, the leftover bark is then either used in agriculture for growing mushrooms, or it's just dumped into this sacred forest where nobody's harvesting anything, and those are hotspots of biodiversity. And those biodiversity hotspots are feeding other areas, such as where the body tree is being harvested. So you can see this form of circularity of value in these traditional economies. And we can use science technology to bring us back to those circular forms. Just because we have high-tech computational systems doesn't mean that we can't use those to circulate forms of value, whether that's ecological value in the case of organic agriculture, or labor value in the case of worker-owned production, worker-owned platforms on the internet, or expressive value in the case of open source sharing and human rights value generation in the form of speech and identity, spirituality, sexuality, whatever that may be. These are visions of what might be if we could transform science and technology. So the roots of these problems go back to colonialism and the idea that these indigenous cultures have to be convinced to be submissive in the face of colonial intrusion. And so they've created this hierarchy where higher civilization is the ones that holds all the science technology, and lower civilizations are the ones that are the so-called primitives. And that's why our schools look so much like factories, is because we've deeply embedded these ideas of a hierarchy and an extractive economy into our forms of education. If you look at demographics, you can see this at work. So Black, Latinx, Native American students are all less likely to graduate with college degrees. If you look at even low-income white families, they're less likely to graduate with college degrees. In fact, 60% of the degrees come from only 24% of the population, the wealthiest segment. And the reason for that underrepresentation is in part that hierarchy we were just looking at. It created this myth of genetic determinism, that some brains are better at doing math and computing and STEM than others. And also a myth of cultural determinism, that you're not being authentic if you become a Black nerd. There's a lack of humanitarian focus in STEM. So when I got my master's degree in systems engineering, it was quite rare to have a class in differential equations that even talked about the need for a social justice perspective. Then, of course, there's a lack of community connections in STEM. So it's always about the benefactors of science and technology being these giant corporations, not these little mom and pop enterprises in our neighborhood. And just the style of STEM lessons, they're very top down. I'm going to pour information into somebody's head. So all 5 of those problems can be addressed through this process of generative STEM, through rethinking science technology as a means to encourage these circular flows of value. And I started with field work in Africa, looking at something called a fractal. A fractal is a shape that repeats itself at many different scales. So here you can see a village in Southern Africa, Baila village, and as a whole, it's a giant ring, and you can see it's a ring that is made up of smaller rings. So here you have the human habitation towards the back of the little corral. This is a single house with a sacred altar towards the back. This is the village as a whole, and within that is the chief's immediate family, and within that is the chief's. Within that is the chief's extended family. Within that is the chief's immediate family, and within that is a very small village, only about 3 feet wide. Now you might ask how humans can fit into a village that's only 3 feet wide. That's because it's not flesh people, these are spirit people. So the ancestors have a ring, and of course their ancestors have an even smaller ring within that. So you can see why we're describing it as a fractal, as a recursive set of scaling shapes. In West Africa, you'll often see these arrayed in sort of scaling rings. So you'll have the woman's house here, and when a baby is born, that baby stays within that little house until the next iteration of life when you're a toddler, and then you can go out into this area. And then in the next iteration of life, you can go out into the village as a whole, and then as an adult, you can go from the village into the world. Now, it also works in reverse. So when you die, there's a little container called the kumpia where the woman of the household keeps her soul. And so they have a ceremony where they break that open, her soul goes off to eternity, and then through reincarnation, it comes back. So it's a beautifully recursive system that goes all the way to infinity and beyond, as they say. And you can see the symbols from it in many cases. For example, the snake that bites its own tail, symbolizing that recursion, that recursive basis for the village. So in order to translate that indigenous knowledge into something that's recognizable in the classroom, we've taken a lot of examples where there was a very specific regular structure of these recursive shapes. And when I asked math teachers, what do you think your kids would understand the best? Everybody pointed to the example of cornrow braiding as a fractal that the kids would understand and be able to sort of wrap their heads around. So that was our first example here. We created this math interface. And then as we got closer to computing education, we decided to switch over to a programming interface so the kids could create these scripts and keep track of the way that they had been using those heritage algorithms. And it works. So we do controlled studies to make the National Science Foundation happy. We'll take one group, so a teacher has two different sections of the same class. We'll take one group as the control, taught the regular way, another group that's using this culture-based set of simulations. And you can get statistically significant improvement, both in STEM performance as well as just interest in STEM careers. So as we've added more and more of these tools, working with indigenous communities all over the world, as well as here in the US, we've come up with a set of steps that we have to do. The first one is to work with cultural representatives, whether that's elders or artisans, whoever can say, yes, this is appropriate for you to use in this way. The second is to get at those heritage algorithms. So we don't want to be imposing information from the outside. We want to be finding out how they think of it and then translating that into the equivalents, the analogs in contemporary classrooms. And finally, we embed those concepts into a design tool that allows students to play around with these heritage algorithms to create and design. So this is a few of the indigenous versions of that. And then as we spoke to the kids more, they said, well, you know, I'm interested in hip hop, I'm interested in graffiti. And so we've added on other repertoires of what we might think of social forms of culture, whether that's skateboarding or team sports or nature or whatever it may be. And so some of the tools also represent those practices. So let's switch over now to those tools. I'm going to pop out of this slideshow here and move over to our website. So that's csdt.org, if you haven't already brought that up. I've logged myself in, but there's a little sign up over here. If you want to sign up for an account, you can do so. And I'm just going to take us through a few of these tools, just so you get a feel for what that's like. So let's start with cornrow curves. Now you can see on the left side, there's a menu. So there's African origins, Middle Passage, civil rights, and hip hop. Those are all historical moments of this transition from the original African braiding practices to the way they're used today. And when I first started working with students, I didn't realize that we had a need for that. I just sort of assumed that everybody would be familiar with these practices. But when I asked kids, and I was teaching in New York at the time, when I asked them where do corner braids come from, they all said, well, they come from Brooklyn, of course. So that's when I started to realize we really need to have this cultural background as part of the tools. We couldn't just launch into the mathematical translations. So here in African origins, you can see our first clay sculpture here from the Louvre in Paris. And that's from about 500 BC. So very, very ancient, but you can see the cornrow braiding in here. So it really helps establish, I think, some of the authenticity of that material. And then this middle photograph here is from a wonderful book written in the 1970s where they interviewed women in West Africa and asked them about the symbolic meaning of different braiding styles. And so from there, you get an understanding of how these represent things like whether or not you're married and what moiety, what kinship division you come from within that particular social group. And the last one here is a wooden sculpture. And I included that because I wanted the kids to understand we're not imposing the mathematics. Africans also have a tradition of doing modeling, of coming up with geometric structures to represent those braiding styles. And you can see this little zigzag in the sculpture here representing those braids. So that's African origins. And then from the Middle Passage, the children get a sense of where these things are coming from, how they get to America. Now, I don't lecture to the kids. We just divide them up into 4 groups and tell them, you guys are now researchers. Go through those pages that you've been assigned and tell us what you thought was interesting, what's worth talking about. So you really get a sense of discovery learning that way. I find that the kids are sometimes very hesitant when they talk about this Middle Passage section. So when they present it, sometimes they'll say heads were shaved upon capture for sanitary reasons. And so at that point in their presentation, I always stop them and say, well, wait a minute, you know, what's really being said there? And of course, it says ostensibly for sanitary reasons, but with the psychological impact. So eventually somebody in the room speaks up and gives us their understanding of what that means. And it becomes this great conversation, but you know, it's in the middle of a math classroom or a computing classroom. So of course, the civil rights era is very important because that's a sort of public rebirth of these things. So they've kind of gone underground, as it were, for many decades. And then during the civil rights era in the 1960s, the Black is Beautiful movement brings them out into the public eye. And the hip hop era then takes them up with completely new forms of innovation. So it's important for kids that are using these tools not to get a sense that these are being museumified. This is about culture in the past. It's also about culture in the future. What my Native American colleagues have been terming future indigeneity, the indigenous future. Or in Africa, in African American communities, you'll hear the term Afrofuturism. So it's this idea that culture exists in both directions on the temporal scale. So moving along, we've got a tutorial here, some challenges if teachers want to use it in the classroom for specific learning goals. But I want us to click on software and just jump right into playing around with some of these simulations. So if you'll click on that link in the menu, please. You can see at the bottom left, we've got a bunch of different images the kids can choose if they want to do some exact simulations, replicas of what we have there. But often the kids just want to mess around and come up with their own designs, and we're happy to let them go along that path. So let's mess around a bit with this braid. You can see there's about 25 of these little plaits, these little crisscross braid twists. And you can see there's a little block here that says repeat 25. So let's change that to a larger number. Kristen, can you have folks type into that little chat box a larger number than 25? And we'll just see what they come up with. 64, 98. I'm going to say 100 because it's easier for me to type that. So let's see what happens with 98 or 100. And immediately we can see what's going on here. It's becoming this logarithmic spiral. And that's shrinking down pretty fast. So we can shrink it down less fast by bringing that closer to 100. So if the scaling factor is at 100%, it doesn't scale down at all, and we'll just get a circle. So let's do greater than 95 and less than 100. I'm going to say 99. And now it's shrinking down much more slowly. My sister-in-law Denise is in the way here. I'm going to delete Denise. Apologies to Denise for deleting her. And I'm going to put in a larger number of repeat loops here. And now we can see that spiral is just going to keep going and keep going and keep going. So we've really opened this up for some exploration possibilities. And we don't have to use boring black and white. I can throw in a little color here. So I'm going to throw in my braiding block. I hope folks are following along with me. And now I've got some lovely colors coming along through the braid. So the kids can just play around with this through trial and error and get a sense of what it means to have an iterative loop or what it means to have a scaling factor. But of course, teachers can set it up in a very didactic way if they want to. So for example, if I set this to scale by 100%, so there's no shrinking at all, and I only do, let's say, 20 of these repeats, that's not quite going to make a full circle. And one of the problems is that I'm only rotating by 7 degrees. So if I rotated by a larger number of degrees, let's say 30 degrees, now it'll make a complete circle, very tight circle. So how do I get that nice big circle? Well, if I repeat by 36 times and I rotate by only 10 degrees, 10 times 36 is 360. So that'll exactly make a circle. So you can see that you quickly can come up with those kinds of little challenge problems that math teachers love so much. So you can either have the kids playing around with this creatively, or you can use it in very targeted ways. Let's now hit our back button here, go back to our website, and we'll look at some of the different ways teachers and kids have used this. So let's click on Outcomes Summary. So this is a cosmetology program in upstate New York. And we started with the kids learning how to make braids on mannequin heads, and then creating these braids. I'm just scrolling down the screen here. Designing some of these things on with our design tools, and then creating 3D models, and then finally a 3D print. And the last part of this was the children installing these in braiding shops and just trying to see, can we have some changes happening in braiding shops? And one of those exciting changes was the adult braiders told us, well, I'm now suddenly finding myself having conversations about African math with my clients. So there's some exciting potential here to use that idea of generative SIM to cycle that value back to the communities where the value originally came from. We don't have to just extract the value and say, oh, now Google and Chevron Oil are going to have something they can pat themselves in the back for in their human resources department, right? We can really deliver the fruits of science and technology innovation to those local entrepreneurial mom and pop size businesses. And we've taken that in another step. Let me go back out to our main site here. I'll just click on the CSTT logo. And if we go down to the bottom, you can see where those adult braiders wanted to take things. So if you click on PH Empowered down at the bottom, what they told us is that they thought we should talk about hair products. And so we figured, wow, we did STEM lessons with cornrow patterns. Why not STEM lessons with beauty products? And of course, I didn't know anything about the history of beauty products, and there's a whole political history to black hair care. You can go back to Garrett Morgan, the famous African-American inventor who invented some of the first gas masks and stoplights, but he really made his fortune in hair products. The same, of course, for Madam C.J. Walker, all the way up to the civil rights movement when the NAACP wanted Black activists to go through some of the civil disobedience training, but they were worried about people getting fired, losing their jobs. And they realized that the women who owned their own braiding salons were folks that couldn't be fired because they owned their own companies. So there's been this intricate intertwining between science and technology and politics and the economy all along. But up in the present day, you suddenly see this new generation of Black entrepreneurs having a sort of springboard for getting the value back into the community. So in a sense, we didn't invent generative STEM. We're just jumping on the bandwagon here. But we would like to see it get into the classrooms and not have to be done in these little one-off sort of shoestring budget projects. So one of the things we noticed when the students started using these materials, started using pH meters and forming their own hair products, is that they would say things in their posters they were creating for their products like removes your poisons from your system, that it's We have a whole list here: a detox, cleanses your ex, cure all, the secret they don't want you to know. Because students were seeing those kinds of ads and they thought that's what's supposed to go along with these beauty products. So we figured that was an opportunity to introduce this idea of controlled studies. And so we even have some links here where students can go online to professional journal articles and see what it looks like when you put something like an organic oil, like coconut oil, up against Johnson & Johnson's mineral oil. And it turns out that a lot of these organic products actually have, scientifically demonstrable better effects for your health. So it's really wonderful to see students now bring that to bear. We have a little outcome summary again here of how cosmetologists, professional braiders, and students have been collaborating together to bring these pH meter construction and lessons to light. So that's within the rubric of what started out as an interest in these African traditions. Let's turn now to Native American indigenous culture. And so next to cornrow curves on our front page, you'll see quilting. And we have quilting divided up into 4 different groups here. We have Gee's Bends, which is African American, Appalachian, which is mostly white, Lakota, which is Native American, and Anishinaabe, which is Native American. Now, if you click on Gee's Bends, you can see a comparison here between West African cloth, the famous kente cloth, and these Gee's Bends cloth. So there's some nice examples here of how the children can think about these heritage algorithms passing down through generations. Under the Appalachian example, we have the radical rose design. So the radical rose is an abolitionist symbol, but you'll see it in these old Appalachian quilts. And I found that kind of confusing when I first started investigating this. There was a whole trove of these old quilts in museums, and they were often labeled quilt used to raise money for the Civil War. So there's a whole side to Appalachian history and culture that has to do with this support for the abolitionist movement. So folks were so poor that they realized they had something in common with folks who had been oppressed through slavery. So I had put this in because although our target groups were underrepresented ethnic groups, African American, Native American, Latinx, we also wanted to think about avoiding a kind of siloing of identity, of telling the kids, if you're Black, you have to use Black culture. And so we also wanted to point out that this multicultural STEM could create some bridges between cultures. We could start some really interesting conversations about what sorts of things folks might have in common. These are Anishinaabe quilts. And you can see there's a polar coordinate system at work here. And so when we get down to the heritage algorithm, we'll be using that technique. Let's jump to our Anishinaabe software here, and we'll click on the Anishinaabe quilting simulation. I'm just going to hit that little green flag, and you can see it's just like the cornrows simulation. And I'm going to detach the bottom of this so it's a little simpler. Here we go. So right now I have a costume called Big Petal. But if I switch that over to flower, now I've got my flower. The flower is so big that most of it's not appearing here. We've got it pumped up to 200% of its size. So let me reduce that to, I think it's around 50% is probably what I want. And it's a little bit dark with that red color. So let me set that costume color to something a little bit lighter. I'll go to 20. And so now you can see our flower pattern being formed. So the kids very quickly can build up this repertoire of symbols. And of course, back when we were going through that cultural background, when we look at Anishinaabe quilts, we had interviewed Alice Wilson here about her family of quilters. This is 5 generations of quilters all in one bunch. And she told us some wonderful stories about the, in particular, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. So many of the women who had survived the boarding school system, where kids were beaten for speaking anything but the national language of French or English, many of those folks just couldn't speak about the experience. It was so horrifying. But Alice found that many of them were avid quilters, and so they could create quilt blocks that would symbolize some of those experiences. They were not all terrible. Some of them were cherished memories, and this one in particular I really love. It's on the far right, the bottom corner. You can see 4 hearts. That's actually representing one jelly bean that had been split into 4 quarters. And so the woman who had that memory said she had smuggled in a little bag of jelly beans with her. And she would take one bean and split it into 4 quarters and give each of her friends a little taste of the jelly bean for that day. And when the children have read through this, we do it just like in cornrows. We divide it up into groups, and each group does a little discovery learning. The kids will often remark on that because they can imagine themselves, sneaking in a little stash of jelly beans. So it's a great way for the kids to recognize that, these questions of political economy and political resistance, it doesn't have to be a big story about revolts. It can also be little forms of everyday resistance. So I want to go now down to teaching materials. And this is Professor Audrey Bennett, who's in the Stamp School of Design. Audrey's my life partner as well as my research partner. And here you can see some of the children at the Harlem Academy workshop. So these are kids from Harlem in New York City who had engaged in developing the virtual designs and then physically rendering them. And we use an iron-on cloth system so that the kids can very rapidly recreate the designs by hand that they had on the screen. And that kind of synthesis between the virtual form and the physical form, that you're not just pressing a button and having it pop out of the 3D printer, but you're really, in a sense, your body is the 3D printer, right? Those kinds of hybrid artisanal practices is something that I think is a very promising way forward when we talk about bringing together the value that the technology has with these older forms of crafting. I'll just click on this 2017 quilting workshop with Anishinaabe students. So these are mostly Native American students in Upper Peninsula, Michigan, who had created the designs. And you can see them here going through that process of taking we did use a 3D printer to create the template so they could cut out the cloth very rapidly. And then here's all the designs together. You'll notice the center is not an Anishinaabe algorithm. So we had a group of students from the Navajo Nation who had come to that summer workshop. And so when they started looking through our website, they said, well, wait a minute, we want to bring our own algorithms to bear on this. So it was really exciting seeing the kids, just take that idea and run with it. Now, recently in Detroit, we presented to the American Indian Health and Family Services group in Detroit. And so they hosted us for a week in the summer. They had seen this and realized that the diversity of Native nations that they had in Detroit could really respond to this well. And we had some wonderful designs from Lumbee Indians, for example, had brought some of their heritage to bear on this. Just a really exciting array of forms that the kids in Detroit had brought to bear on it. Also, under the teaching materials link here, you can see we have some electronic quilts. So we can bring in LEDs and Arduinos and have the kids think about how to move those heritage algorithms into other digital forms of fabrication. Let me go back out to the main site here. So we've done some quilting, some cornrows. Let's take a look at Adinkra. And I talked about the Adinkra economy as a form of a generative economy. But here's how we've brought that to bear in these classrooms. So the children reading through this section, of course, start by learning a little bit about the origins of Adinkra. Here's our twin crocodiles that share the same stomach. But you can also see how Adinkra has been used in various places we photographed around Ghana. So here it is in a balcony in architecture. Here are the students at one of the local Ghanaian schools using our design tools. This is in New York City. So there's an African burial ground in the middle of Manhattan that's now a National Park Service is running it. And one of the coffin lids had what they think is an Adinkra symbol on it. And so they put Adinkra symbols all around the sides of this plaza right in the middle of Manhattan. This is from a neighborhood we used to bring some of our tools to in Albany. They have a gun buyback program called SNUG, which is gun spelled backwards. But they use Maputo, the Adinkra symbol for a reconciliation, the knot of reconciliation. You tie the knot when you make peace with somebody. So really wonderful to see all these different forms being used across the world. And here's how Adinkra symbols got created. So it originally starts with an observation of nature. You can see here a drop of water has ripples. That vibration moves across the membrane of the water. So it's memorialized in these golden symbols as the drop of power that ripples across society. And then that becomes sort of geometricized into the Adinkra symbol. And you'll see that over and over again. So here's the traditional indigenous temple. Here's the symbol on the temple doors. You can see power radiating in all directions, just like the water droplet. And here is what the Ghanaian artisans were calling the church symbol, but I'm assuming that's a translation. And what they meant was the indigenous temple symbol. A lot of their symbols have these beautiful logarithmic spirals. And so you can see those logarithmic spiral forms in nature. And so these are representing the various ways that horns grow or other physical artifacts grow in nature. Really exciting to see that. So of course, we show the children the way that the bark is harvested and pounded in these traditional mortars, and then cooked down to make ink. This is an Adinkra symbol, Asisa Yaduru, earth and balance. So on the one side you have humans, on the other side you have the earth. And so you can see this idea of sustainability is quite ancient in the case of Adinkra economies. And let's just jump right to our software here. Oops, sorry. Our software is not quite online yet. This is a brand new site. We just transferred it from New York to Michigan. But I'll take you over to our teaching materials here, and you can see how the computational thinking, ways of using the Adinkra stamps with a 3D printer, for example. So that lesson plan is all well represented here. All right, let me go back out here to Anishinaabe arcs. So these are 3D, we're back to Native American indigenous forms. And again, it's about this generative relationship with nature. So here we have some of our materials. You can see Earl Oshawanigan stripping tree bark and thinking about whether it was a dry year or a wet year, which then determines whether he's going to take that sapling from a hilly area or an area that's located down near the water. So there's really a very intense relationship in these systems between what's going on in nature and what's going on in culture. And those are used for these generative forms, both in the STEM classroom as well as in the original economy. All right, let me go back out to our slideshow here. And I had stopped at slide 23, I believe. I think I've got about, looks like about 20 minutes left. So let me just do a few of these last slides. And then we can go back to Kristen and take some questions. So one of the things we saw from the Navajo Nation when students were simulating these rugs, they would make these little commentaries on what their design meant to them. And some of them were sort of questioning whether or not there was some loss of indigenous culture. And I think that's very important to sustain the students' own sense of critical agency. You know, we shouldn't be trying to put a happy face on everything. If the students want to formulate a critique through their designs, even of a critique of what we're doing, we should support that and not censor it. We mentioned the problem of the style of STEM lessons being too abstract, not having concrete anchoring. And so we can support that, I think, very well with the 3D printing and hybrid traditional and technological fabrication. We also have done some work with art teachers. So we brought it into an art class or a STEAM class, STEM plus arts. And after the students have done their rigorously generated design on the screen, they can use a kind of artistic rendering method to reinterpret it and bring in a much looser form of creativity to bear as they move that into a physical form. We've also done some work in sports. So if you think of sports as a cultural identity, there's lots of exciting opportunity to do DIY ergonomics. So the students are creating their own pressure plates and photo gates, and all of that is available on our website as well. Just in general, we want to think about this as a kind of expansion of agency. So we start out simulating that, we start out simulating that original artifact in a very specific way, because we want to make sure that we're working with things that we have permission for, and it's being represented in a way that elders and artisans feel is proper to represent. But as we get into the virtual design tools, we can open that up, and the kids can start to create a kind of creative exploration of their own designs. And then as we move to that third level of physical rendering, they can bring other kinds of creativity to bear on that. And then as we move into that fourth level, we can start these interactions with the community. So you saw that in the case of the braiding shops. We've also now started to work with our Native American partners in some relationships with what's going on in the community. So there's all kinds of ways that these can interact with actual adult economies as well. And here's a few other examples of how we can keep that generative loop going. So in Ethiopia, one of the architects there, Xavier Vialta, has created some shopping malls and some school that actually has a fractal layout. And what they found is that by not using those old Euclidean designs, but having fractal perforations in the skin of a building, for example, you can make things more breathable and more sustainable. This is a science fiction author, Nnedi Okofor. She writes about a girl who leaves home, and so she encodes her family history and her braids using a kind of coding mechanism. And she brings some artifacts from Africa that are fractal artifacts onto the spaceship. So it's a sort of Afrofuturist reimagining of what we've been doing with the design tools. And Nnedi has given us permission to now take some excerpts from her book and bring that back into our design tool repertoire. So you'll see a science fiction tool where we're starting to incorporate some of that. So you can see how these cycles of value, having the value flow and circulate rather than being extracted, are something that we're trying to get to. Here's a little diagram of it. Some of our academic articles with statistically significant results. A little diagram of the generative loop that was happening in upstate New York with Native American students in aquaponics. My little cartoon here of how to think about the difference between extractive STEM and generative STEM. So here you can see that we're diversifying the pipeline, but we're not diversifying the bombs and pollution coming out of the pipeline. So we want a pipeline that really circulates value, that doesn't extract it. And then finally, this is a vision for what we're going to be trying to do in these little mom and pop fabrication places in Brooklyn and Detroit and some locations in West Africa. For February, we have these Afrofuturist pop-up shops planned. So you can look for some links on our website where you can buy materials from artisans in these low-income communities that are using these digital fabrication techniques. Okay, Kristen, I am going to stop there, mute my mic, and if you can tell us how to conduct this chat, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. So we had one question about had you considered Afrofuturism and building something around that from one of our alums, but I think you've already addressed that. And what other questions or thoughts do you have about how this looks on the ground? Any questions coming from you guys? You know, Ron, I wonder if you could talk, I think you addressed this a little bit already, but the question of trying to be representative of multiple cultures and the work you've done to try to not just show one traditional gender's work, but to be, to reach out to kids of all genders. And or you can answer Lisa's question, which areas in Michigan are currently participating other than Detroit?
Am I now unmuted?
Yep.
Okay. Let me first try to answer that question about multiculturalism. I've switched over to our old site, which is csdt.rpi.edu, because our new site I see hadn't yet been updated. I was talking with a teacher about his concern that we had too many female-oriented tools. So we had cornrow braiding and quilting and beadwork. And he said, you know, for some of these teenage boys, they're just starting to sort of form their identity as a young man, and it just seemed too girly. So I was looking around for some crafting, and I stumbled across this leather-tooled skull. And I thought, yeah, nothing says teenage boy like leather-tooled skulls. So we launched this tooled leather section of the website. And I asked Sean, our high school teacher, if that was successful. And he said, not only was it successful with the boys, it was successful with the girls as well. They were really attracted to it. So I think, you know, that's the thing about these broader appeals is sometimes you think that you're sort of targeting things in a particular way when actually you're broadening it for everybody. And one of the features I stumbled across as we were doing the tooled leather, I was looking at this Northern African group, the Tuareg, just because I have a lot of Tuareg leather around the house that I've collected in my travels. And it's beautiful, beautiful designs. But as I was reading it, I noticed they kept talking about female forms of power in that culture. So for example, the women are actually the ones that are making the scabbards for these swords, and there's murals of women warriors in these villages. So I started to realize that even though we had brought this in as something to appeal more to boys, there was actually some really interesting opportunities in sort of rethinking gender roles and adding in some gender diversity here. Also, as we were doing that, I stumbled across these Celtic designs, and I was thinking that would be great to have a little bit here to show that it's diverse across not just Native American, African American, Latinx, but also European identities as well. And as I started to look into it more, I came across these maps showing the extent to which Celtic culture had one time gone across Europe, all the way from Ireland to Turkey. And of course, there was a sort of colonialism of Europe eating itself, right? That the Roman Empire comes up and these little tribes get stomped out. So I'm wondering now if there isn't an opportunity for kids with European heritage to also start thinking about what those indigenous cultures in Europe were like, what kind of relationships they had with sustainability and nature as well. So there's some really exciting opportunities around cultural diversity, to answer your question, Christian. And then you had another question as well?
Yeah, so we're looking for a follow-up on the Afrofuturist question was, how could we incorporate that into the cornrows workshop? She's saying, I'm thinking of the choice to only use natural hairstyles in Black Panther, for example, and the intentionality that went into those hair designs. And if you guys are interested in Black Panther, I'm just going to insert my little librarian self around and say that there are lots of interviews online and lots of podcasts with the costume designer from Black Panther, whose name, I'm sorry, eludes me. But that could be a great tie-in with this question. So Afrofuturism being put in the cornrows workshops?
Absolutely. In fact, if you look here, we've got 4 sections. So we've started work on a 5th section, which is the Afrofuturist section. And so this summer, we hired some student interns, high school students in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And we just had them go out online, and I wanted to know, from their point of view, what was attractive about Afrofuturism. So what sorts of things should we include? So we have a big sort of a file dump of all the things that they found that they thought were worth including. And now we're going to have to sift our way through that and come up with a coherent narrative. The Black Panther part is kind of a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, I was really excited to see international attention being brought to bear around those African designs and African heritage being in the future and not just the past. On the other hand, there is a kind of extractive feel to it, right? So the studio that made it, so it's Marvel Studios, but they're owned by Disney. They're making billions off of that film. And I don't think billions of dollars are now getting delivered to those African villages where those designs originate. So again, you want to take a kind of generative analysis. Where was the value first created, and what can we do to make sure that value gets returned to those areas? The other part of the generative idea is that you don't want value to be in alienated or extracted forms. So for example, when folks say, oh, well, let's send money to those villages, that money is already in a form that people are going to feel sort of forced to use in certain ways and not others. And so if you can have exchange systems that don't trap us into thinking that, well, the only way I can spend my money is going shopping in a mall, right? But you can actually go to an exchange system that says, oh, your money can also be delivering value to locally produced goods. That's a more generative way of doing it. So it's more complicated than just saying, I'm going to go to court and sue somebody to get a share of so-and-so dollars. And really that shift to the generative economy isn't just a loss of where the ownership of the means of production is at. It's also a loss of where identity is at. So if you've lost your identity as a producer, you start to form an identity around consumption. So you start to think that, the way I can define who I am is going shopping in the mall. And if you ask teenagers, often that's, their go-to point for just where they can hang out with their friends. So there's a kind of colonization that's happening in our civic sphere that we also have to address. So I mentioned that in reference to your question about Black Panther, because I don't want to just glom onto, whatever is the newest little media fad to happen, right? On the other hand, if that's what's going to perk interest in these African traditions, then let's go there and let's have the kids formulate these kinds of critiques and mess around with those materials. So I think there's tremendous advantages and there's wonderful ways of bringing that Afrofuturism together with some of these older forms. I don't think we have to think about natural hairstyles as being the outcome of bringing in a more generative STEM practice. So if students are using these pH meters and creating beauty products that respond best to where human health lives, that doesn't necessarily mean those have to be made out of organic substances or that the style you bring to bear has to look like it was designed with that in mind. So there's all sorts of neat ways of bringing high tech to these different, the broad diversity of fashions, including Afrofuturist fashions.
So Ron, lots of people are excited about what you've done. There are some questions about like, what if I need to do this as a library program? Are there ways to scale it down, or how would you structure it so that it were successful in a library? Is this a one shot, one night event? Is this a one-day project? Is this a series with multiple interactions? How would that work?
Well, we've done this in all sorts of different ways. So I think the most common one is to stretch it out over 3 one-hour periods. So we would pick some tool that is particularly appropriate for the group. So if you have a highly heterogeneous group, you might want to be using the quilting tools. If you have a mainly African American group, you might want to be using cornrows. There's no particular reason why you have to do it that way. So over the summer, we had a pretty heterogeneous group in our Upward Bound program, white and African American and other heritages were present. And they absolutely loved the Adinkra practice. And so all the kids were excited and having fun with it. Whatever it is that folks come up with, and you know, maybe it comes down to having the kids pick which tool ends up being used. But you want to have the first hour dedicated to just going through that cultural material. And I've noticed occasionally I'll have math teachers or computing teachers say, well, I don't really have time for that. Let me just jump right into the software. And there's really a loss of understanding when that happens. So I really encourage folks to bring kids together, have them create some presentations or some kind of outcome deliverable that's based on their going through those pages. That would be a great 1 hour first meeting, or 40 minutes, whatever you have. In the next meeting, I would go into the tutorials. And so we have, each of the tools has its own tutorial, and it's worth being able to slow that down and just have the kids go through the tutorial as they see fit. And some of the kids will be quicker and some will be slower, and everybody can just go at their own pace. And then in the last part of it, you want to have the kids using the software. And now they're coming up with virtual designs. And if they've signed into our classroom, they can upload those designs. So I've just clicked on projects, and you can see all these different projects that kids have come up with. Some of them have named the project after themselves. I believe this is actually one from the workshop we did in Ghana over the summer, but you can see it's the Scales of Justice. And that was some costumes that were uploaded by students in Michigan. And so there's this interesting hybridity that starts to occur as kids go into these projects and start using a project that was created by some group of students from another place around the world. So once they have their virtual design uploaded, you've now gone through about 3 hours. And sometimes there's enough time to pack it into 3 days if you've done sort of a compressed version, but often you need a 4th day where the students are now doing a kind of physical rendering of these things, whether that's with a 3D printer or a laser cutter or whatever practice it is that you want to do. And for some of these, you know, it can even be done in paper. So I think our cornrow curves is one of the ones where we had, yes, paper sculpture from cornrow simulations. So you don't need fancy equipment like a 3D printer. You can just print these out of a paper printer, have a little X-Acto knife or some kind of cutting tool, and the kids can make these wonderful paper sculptures from those designs. So whether you're trying to do it from high end or low end, it's amenable to all sorts of different directions. I think the quilting is a great one to start with because you don't have to worry. We've got, you know, Gee's Bends, which is African American, Appalachian, which is mostly white, Lakota and Anishinaabe, which is Native American. And then we added 4 directions quilts. So these are Iroquois Hmong, which is Asian, Celtic again, and then some Hawaiian examples here. So no student is going to feel sort of, left out or targeted with that kind of diversity. And the physical rendering is very easy to do. So we have a little how-to page on the physical renders here. And so you might need 4 days if you're doing an hour a day, but I think it's well worth the extra time to go through the physical rendering as well. This is actually a t-shirt that she's creating here, and this one's kind of a hang up. And then we've got all the materials here and some links for purchasing it and the details of how to do everything. Not sure if I answered the question, but let me stop there and check back in with you, Kristen.
Sure. So we have a question about how within your tool, do teachers create a classroom, and then do students sign in with a particular classroom tag?
So to start a classroom, go to the About page. And down here, you'll see video tutorials. So there's classroom creation, classroom administration, how students will use the classrooms. And then also on the main page, there's, if you click on the little more button here, there's just some basics, how to save to the hard drive, save to the cloud, and so on.
Thanks for that. And then there's a general question, Ron, about there seem to be some librarians who would like to take this on, but maybe would like to be in conversation with librarians. Some people have put their contact information in the chat. Do you have any other recommendations for how they could connect with other people doing work like this?
So I will make an effort to go through all of those, or have my staff go through all of those, and we will connect people.
That's great. That is more than I thought you would offer. That's fantastic. So I think that's a great place for us to stop. Ron, if you'll just go back to the slides for one moment. We do have a bit of housekeeping to do. And so first, as Ron sort of wraps up, here's 3 things that you might see as takeaways today. And one is to recognize that computational thinking isn't something new or isn't something constricted to Silicon Valley, but that these complex algorithms come from multiple cultural backgrounds, and that sophisticated thinking is hundreds and thousands of years old. Secondly, Ron, what does it mean to make a generative economy and not cheese? I am a cheese lover.
So often when I describe what I'm doing, I'll run into somebody that says, oh, so you're helping tempt the kids into the STEM pipeline, as if they were mice after cheese. And so I wanted to point out that that's not at all what we intend. This isn't sprinkling a little sugar on the bad tasting medicine of STEM or tempting kids through the STEM pipeline. This is really about showing a transformative vision for what STEM could be and integrating that into the classroom. And that's why I have number 3 here. Generative STEM unites Indigenous generative tradition with contemporary science and technology, because we want to make sure to get across the idea that this is for all students.
Excellent. And if you go to the next slide, I just want to let you all know about what's coming in the coming months. Right before Halloween, I'm really excited to have this session on the surveilled child. So the upside of Internet of Things and things like the Ring doorbells and Fitbits and things is that we're able to track things in new ways. And the downside is that children are going to grow up knowing they're being tracked. So Wendy Stevens is a fantastic thinker. Some of you know her work from YALSA. She's going to talk about what this means for children to be growing up in this new era of data tracking and observation. Then in November, we're going to have our U of M faculty colleague, Florian Schaub, who does really exciting work with data privacy and information privacy and gets quoted in newspapers all over the world. He's going to come talk about what is data privacy as it relates to libraries and how that goes beyond things like not sharing their circulation records with others. Then in December, Melissa Johnston, who's done some great work, especially in rural communities with STEM instruction in libraries, is going to talk about that STEM instruction and digital tools. In January, Tiffany Russell from the Niles District Library near South Bend is going to talk about their initiative to partner Bachelor of Social Work folks with a Master of Social Work to bring more social work triage work into libraries. In February, our U of M colleague Colleen Van Lent, who also is one of the top 100 instructors for the Coursera MOOC series, she's going to talk about web accessibility and how we can make our sites more accessible and more amenable to folks with different backgrounds. And this is particularly important given that the baby boomers are aging, and so are their eyes, and so are my eyes. I'm not even baby boomer yet. And she'll have some real practical tips. And then in March, Megha Subramaniam from the University of Maryland is going to talk about design thinking in libraries. So we hope you'll join us. I'm going to post the evaluation one more time. That'll be really helpful to help Ron get some feedback from you, and also for us to get some feedback about other topics you'd like to see. And with that, we're going to bring this webinar to a close, and we hope to see many of you next month. Thanks, everybody.